frocks and frolics, sew like a pro tutorials. Today I'm going to show you the Natalie. The Natalie is a summer dress for a child aged 3 to 6. It's got a cute little ruffle at the top, it's got fantastic hem trim, and I'm going to show you how this would be made commercially. So on with the show, enjoy and let me know how you got on. For the front you should have cut out the front lining and the actual front. You also need 2 straps which are going to be put on there. For the back you should have now these pieces. You have cut the slit. The actual dart is going to go up to about here, so that when you're sewing it, it is so much easier, you don't have to mark anything. You also have on the back the facing. Touch the facing like so, so that you've got a very neat little back. This is the back, so you can see we've got again 2 pieces. This is your front piece, this is cut on the fold, so it opens out to quite a large piece. I've also cut in this fabric some bias strips which I'm going to attach, and I'm going to make a frill with this. Similarly to Flower Girl sash, but just not as wide, I've cut myself, instead of using the iron-on interlining, a fairly firm curtain lining. I've cut my sash on the fold again. You can see it goes in and goes back out here. We have got the shaping in it, so it goes slightly smaller towards the waist. I've also cut 2 long stems, and finally for the hem of the skirts, put my pattern piece on it on the fold, see how much I need, and cut it maybe this much longer, so that way I know I've got the right amount. My next step is to now attach my facing here to my lining. Turn it over. You can check yourself by just doing that, see whether it actually goes to the end. If you're pinning this, put in some horizontal pins. You don't need to take them out when you're sewing. 1 centimeter seam allowance, lock your stitches in. So I've done this on both of them now. So I've got my 2 corresponding pieces. Now you also need to put in the darts, right sides facing. How do you know how high to go? Now, I never actually measure this very much. You can see here, this is where my armhole goes, and about a centimeter lower, that's to where the dart goes. So I'm just going to go, put a line there, just with my fingers, and I aim for my finger. And as I reach my finger, I'm actually locking my threads in, and I've done my dart. Next I'm picking up my actual back pieces, the outside, in this lovely fabric, and I've got my snip here. So again, I fold it over and I put in my dart. I look at where my armhole is, a centimeter lower, invisible line, marked with my finger, and off I go. Now it's perfect, and I'm done with this bit. I want to make a little frill here. You're folding it in once, and you're folding the next bit right to that edge. Now this is actually a fantastic technique to use. This is how professionals do it when they do like really fine hems on georgettes, etc. And I'm also going to gather this. And the easiest way to put a gather stitch in is go on your straight stitch, very large, the largest you've got, and you put in 2 lines of stitching. I'm going to do my next one. Line it up with the stitch you've just done. So now we've got 2 stitches here, so I'll just grab my top stitching. Don't pull too hard. What you don't want is this to rip, because then you'd have to do it all again, and that's really not very much fun. I have got a really pretty little edge which I'm going to put into the front of my dress. I don't actually pin this because I find, to be honest, it's always easier when you don't. We don't want to sew into the seam allowance here. Curve it upwards so it comes out. Have a pin at the ready so you can arrange them. And now I'm going to stitch between the two lines that I've got here. Trim away your excess here that you've got at the top, and it's on. So when it goes up, it'll be really pretty like this. Now the next thing we want to put on there is our strap. And again, sew them together, centimetre seam allowance through. Now this is a neat little trick. No need to take it out from the sewing machine. Just go on to the next bit. Right, now I've sewn them. The next thing is to turn them inside out. For that I'm using my fabric turner. There's a little hook on the fabric turner at the top, and all you do is you just hook that in, pull your fabric over it like that. Take a pin and pull through what hasn't come out there. Now I've ironed my two straps, but if I just put them on like that, although they look nice, they look a little bit homemade. So what I want to do is I want to stitch along. And you can see here that this look is so much more professional. What you don't want to do here is get it the wrong way around. So if you put it like this, you can't really. You know that this has to face the back. And if you use the other one, let's have a look at this, where it's slanted like that, this piece would come out like this. So you know it's got to be this one here, yeah, where the slant literally goes that way. So they lie straight on top of each other. So you then fold this one back and you pin it right on top of your frill that you've got. And you do the same on the other side. You don't want this to go wrong now. Okay, so that is right here, right on the edge. Okay. So we're closing it across the top. And what I've done is I've put some horizontal pins in again, so that when I am sewing it, I can now turn over and I sew from the side where I can actually see what I've already gone. Now what I do is I literally sew from exactly where you can see the stitches. I just sew over the top of that. Again, you've got this homemade look to it. So what you do is you open it out and put the seam allowance facing your sewing machine. You go in from where you started again, same point, and forcing the fabric apart. This is quite important. You sew about 2 millimeters away from the edge. So what you've now got is a line of stitching here which will firm up this whole lot already. So we're now sewing the arm in. And we only need to go to that point. We're cutting across the corner. You also might want to trim the seam allowance back a little bit. You snip it. And you also stitch back the seam allowance. So you do the same again, seam allowance towards your machine, forcing it apart and going to ease it into the machine because it will prevent it from stretching. Go as fast as you can go. You won't be able to go all the way up to the top. Right. And again, what you've got is a really firm edge. It automatically lies flat that way. Again, make absolutely sure that you get it right. Put the pin in. Centimetre away from the edge. Now I can put a few pins in. Do that on the other side as well. Now I can sew it. Centimetre seam allowance. Need to be exactly next to your strap, not on top of it or anything. And again, we cut across the corners so that it's not tied inside. We're cutting our seam allowance back, snipping our curve, and as far as we can go, we will top stitch the seam allowance back. It gives you a more professional look. I'm moving out my corners with a needle. Because this stitching back the seam allowance is so very effective, you also do it here. So the seam allowance goes always towards the lining. The back automatically folds back like this. That's what you want. That's where your professional look comes from. Now I just want to show you what it looks like before the seam allowance is stitched back. Here you can see this puffy edge whereas when you stitch back the seam allowance, it automatically lies flat. I've ironed this so it's nice and flat. And the next thing you want to do is you want to close your center back. If you are on a domestic overlocker, overlock the side seam either side and then sew it together from this point here all the way down. So what I'm doing is a repetition of what I've shown you earlier. I'm going to a narrow rolled edge hem to the point that I need to leave open. I've just sewn this together on my lovely machine there, which does the seaming and the overlocking at the same time. If you haven't got that, you need to overlock each side and then sew it together. Put on our hem trim. Now this is a really lovely trick. What you need to do is you work from the inside to the outside, so you're actually sewing on right face onto the wrong face of the fabric, and then it's turned up and then turned in to create the hem, which is really pretty. Centimeter seam allowance. Pick up your other piece. You can put this to the side. So now to make sure this sits very well, I stitch the seam allowance back again. I've ironed this over first. I've taken this on the ironing board like that, turned this in, then you iron it up and you're getting the beautiful trim. Check out that the height is the same before you stitch it down, because afterwards you can't really get into it anymore. Stitch fairly close to the edge here, sort of a millimetre off. Next we want to attach the front skirt to the upper front. We're going to gather it across the top. Take the widest stitch length you've got, put your presser foot against the fabric. So we now have two lines of stitching next to each other. Just pick the upper threads, do not pick up the lower threads, because that locks the stitching in. Now I pick up my front, turn it so I can see what I've done here, and on the side where the stitching is locked in, I put one pin, and I take the other side and equally I put a little pin in there. When I've got the right amount, I pick up my threads here, I twist them around this, okay, and you might want to put one pin here in the middle. You want to sew in the center of your two stitching lines. Make sure that these are nice and even and look good. I repeat this process with the back now. So now I've done that side as well. The next step here is to close the side seams all the way. You make sure that you've got the seams on top of each other. Now I'm going to overlock it. So this is overlocked. Now the old-fashioned way would be to tuck this in like that, and of course you can do that and you can stitch it all by hand. That would be very nice. It is a summer dress, it's supposed to be quick and easy, so what I do is I just put a pin. To do this you need to really force it apart and then stitch right next to it. Very often when you're doing children's wear, it's just the most simplest things that work well. I'm going to put in my buttonholes now, which is not very difficult to do actually, but what you must know is how wide is your button. My button needs a buttonhole of 1.5. Now I need to mark them. You want to be 1 centimetre away from the edge. I'm using an air erasable pen. You also want to be 1 centimetre down, and at the bottom we want to go up a little bit, 1.2. Now I take the middle of the two, mark it. Every sewing machine comes with foot to put in a buttonhole. I'm putting my needle down and I've got my buttonhole. Gently cut in between. I'm going to sew my buttons on, so all I do is I put this on top of each other. Put your needle through the edge of your buttonhole, and where it lands, that's where you want to put your button.